Well, it's good to be with y'all this morning. Most of us here today remember a time when we got our bad news about the world once, maybe twice a day. I said most of the time. We have some younger people here today, so y'all may not remember the time when you only found out about the bad things in the world once or twice a day. If you grew up without television, you may have seen your dad or mom perusing the newspaper at the breakfast table. Did anyone here grow up when they were kids without a television? Some of us, maybe for a little bit of the time. You might have seen your mom or dad looking at the newspaper at the breakfast table. Maybe they sighed at what they read, or they gave an audible, ugh. But they eventually put the paper down, took a sip from their coffee cup, and asked you what your day looked like. They might have mentioned the game from the night before, or the neighbors who invited the family over for dinner that night. But eventually, everyone got up from the table, walked out of the door to live your life, and the only interaction you had with the tragedies going on outside of your little community or your little family was in that audible sigh or ugh that your parents gave when they were reading the paper. When we got older, though, it was us reading the paper. We read those stories about World War II and the Vietnam War that were tragic, but far away. And the one about JFK and Dallas being shot, pretty close, but still pretty distant. Eventually, the 5 o'clock news, and maybe if you watched the late night news, gave us a visual, some deeper insight into the darkness that was going on in the world. But even then, with 2 or 3 exposures a day to the bad news, there could still be a lightness in the way we lived our lives. The world was dark. It was broken. We could feel it. But it was also full of lightness and ball games and picnics and parades. Then, the news industry figured out that people would watch the news around the clock if you let them. So they created CNN and Fox News, then MSNBC, and all the other 24-hour news stations. And before you knew it, we were glued to the television every chance we could get to hear about the trial of O.J. Simpson and the impeachment of a president, and eventually the attack on America in 2001. And then we begin to get the stories on our computers. But even if we put our television in our rooms and kept them going 24 hours a day, as many of us did right after 9/11, and even if we were sitting at our computers for hours on end, clicking refresh to see if there was anything new, we still had to walk away. We still had opportunities to walk away from it. We had to go get away from the bad news to go to work or eat or shower, hopefully. The windows of time when we weren't exposed to every tragedy under the sun got smaller and smaller, but it still existed. And then something happened. Can anyone guess what happened to where we couldn't escape it anymore? We put the news on these things. We put it everywhere we went. These little things closed the window of light to where we basically had nowhere to go to escape the bad news of the world. It follows us everywhere we go, or rather we carry it wherever we go. Because of this, because we get our news on these things and we can't escape the bad news, our collective brains are trying to adjust. And one thing our brains are trying to figure out is the answer to this question: when did the world get so bad? We see wars in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, just to name a few. We see cops profiling and shooting young black men at an alarming rate, and we see an equally alarming amount of attacks on our peace officers by armed citizens. We see rampant poverty and hunger in our very country, and economic collapse seems to always be lurking around the corner. There are violent assaults, there are new diseases popping up every day, and many of our schools are failing. You've noticed I haven't even mentioned the presidential election or the candidates. I'll leave that for another day. When did it get this bad? I'm not sure if this answer will comfort you or disturb you, but here's the answer. It has always been this bad. Brother has been killing brother since Cain killed Abel. We have been deceiving each other since Jacob deceived Esau. Lies and destruction have been a part of the fabric of our world since the Garden of Eden and the Tower of Babel. I heard someone say recently about all the racial strife going on in our country, and I believe this to be true, that racism isn't getting worse, it's getting filmed. I think the same thing can be said about all the bad news that we see. It's not getting worse, we're just carrying it in our pockets. We see it all the time now. The book of Lamentations, which I read from earlier, is the perfect soundtrack to the world we live in, because it was written during a time of disaster and seeming hopelessness. It was written during a time much like our time. And it asks some of the same questions we ask, and grieves many of the same losses that we grieve. The theologian Walter Brueggemann likes to note this about the book of Lamentations, that the feel of the book when we read it is almost identical to the feel our country felt in the weeks and the months after September 11th, 2001. They were asking the same questions because they were having a similar experience. In 586 BCE, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and shipped many of its citizens into exile. Those who remained were under Babylonian control. The book of Lamentations, which has been ascribed at times to the prophet Jeremiah, who had warned that this would happen, reads as if someone is sitting on top of the rubble, crying out amidst the destruction. We all remember the cries that we saw on Ground Zero at 9/11. Picture that. That's what the book of Lamentations feels like. It's literally a book of laments. And the word lament means crying or wailing. It begins with these words which I read earlier. This is the beginning of the book. How like a widow she has become. She that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile with suffering and hard servitude. She lives now among the nations and finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her festivals. It's fall festival time around Texas. Imagine all the work we put into those and no one comes to them. All her gates are desolate, her priests groan, her young girls grieve, and her lot is bitter. Her foes have become her masters. Her enemies have prospered. Because the Lord has made her suffer for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away, captives before the foe. From daughter Zion has departed all her majesty. Her princes have become like stags that find no pasture. They fled without strength before the pursuer. It's enough to make you want to eat a whole thing of ice cream, isn't it? Just sit in front of the TV and decompress. If we simply read these words on face value, we are likely to become very depressed. As Americans, we don't like this darkness. We want to get to the good stuff. We are always looking for the light at the end of the tunnel. At the very least, and at our worst, we at least want to get revenge for all the bad things that have been done to us, which we can sometimes believe falsely is the light at the end of the tunnel. We often think revenge is the light at the end of the tunnel. After 9/11, in addition to the revenge part, we wrote songs about the really important things of life. We held each other closer and we reminded ourselves that things would get better again. When the economy collapses, we look at all the times it has done so before and recovered, and we are comforted. When we see the racism that is still embedded in the very fabric of our country, we ask, okay, what can we do to fix this? And there's nothing wrong with this impulse to get to the good stuff, to fix things. That's actually a very healthy Christian response. The problem, though, is that we try to get to this too quickly. We skip over an important step in the process, and that step is lament. It's lamentation. Since this summer, or the past couple of years, particularly this summer, since the shootings of unarmed black men at the hands of cops have become prevalent in the news, I've sought to engage conversation with many of my black friends to gauge their thoughts and solutions for the problem. Invariably, almost all the time, they all tell me this one thing. They're glad I want to make things better and to find solutions. But they believe, and I think rightly, that many of the dominant people in our society tend to try to make the desired outcome more present than it actually is. We want to make things seem like it's not as bad as it actually is. Many of them believe the answer to our problem begins, and I think they're right, with acknowledging how bad things are. It begins with weeping and mourning. It begins with no longer saying, no, things are not that bad. It begins with lament. If we are looking for a people whose experience in our country almost mirrors the experience of God's people in the Old Testament, it is those in the black community, who in many ways continue to be exiled from the American experience. They have a thing or two to teach us about lament. Walter Brueggemann says this about lament, and I think these are powerful words. He says that lament is summoning God. He said that when he was in seminary, and me as well, and many of you, we were taught that God takes all initiatives in human contact. But Brueggemann says this just isn't true. If you look at all the transactions that happened with Jesus, the experience he had with hurting and sick people, if you remember Jairus and the blind Bartimaeus and all of those needing healing and even resurrection from the dead, the needy person took the initiative and summoned Jesus into the transaction. What he calls psalms of disorientation are laments, which are in the book of Psalms and also the book of Lamentations, basically are prayers that summon or seek to mobilize God, based on the assumption that if you don't summon God, if you don't cry out to God, nothing will happen. And that causes us to think kind of primitively, but correctly, about the power of prayer. That we really are summoning God into the transaction, because if you are summoning God, who has the power to change things, then God will become involved. It is very primitive. And we all think we know, and all we know about that is that people who are in great distress do pray that way, even though those whose lives are well-oriented may think it's foolish or superstitious to pray that way. Lament, our crying out to God, is summoning God to the transaction of our experience. Summoning God to our experience. Our challenge then is to learn to participate in lament. It is to see the darkness and the brokenness in our world and to weep for it rather than deny that it exists. It is for us to name the brokenness in our world, because if we don't name it, we can't ask God to be present in it. When you face troubles and trials of many kinds, don't run away from it. Don't be afraid to weep when death occurs. Don't try to explain away the pain in our world. Don't close the window to the bad news. Keep it open. Because only when we keep it open can we get to the really good part of lament. The part where God actually intervenes. Without the first two chapters of Lamentations, which are all everything I read, it's all death and destruction and doom and gloom, we can never get to Lamentations 3. We can never get to the good parts that reads, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is good to those whose hope